Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Jake Wyman with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this week's edition of Capital Clarity on defending traditional family values. Traditional family values have been under attack for some time, whether in our classrooms, universities, entertainment, or even by our own government. It seems in every area of life, families are coming last. It's why we unveiled our Freedom and Family Agenda just last year. Luckily, we have valuable allies like the Idaho Family Policy Center, who are fighting with us side by side to protect Idaho's families. Our speaker today is the driving force behind this agenda. Blaine Conzatti, president of the Idaho Family Policy Center, has established a proven track record of achievements in the family policy movement, including successfully leading the charge to get the Heartbeat Bill, the No Public Funds for Abortion Act, and Simon's Law enacted into Idaho law. His passion in accomplishing this legislation is driven by a want to help Christians fulfill the cultural commission to advocate basic biblical truths in the public square. Please welcome Blaine Conzatti.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? As Jake said, my name is Blaine Conzatti, and I serve as president of Idaho Family Policy Center. We're so grateful for the work that Idaho Freedom Foundation does. So grateful that this event, man, such a service to the public, and I'm sure you guys come week after week and find it very valuable. So certainly a big kudos and thank you to Idaho Freedom Foundation and all that you guys do, and for the victories that we've been able to achieve together over the years. It's been exciting to see. So I serve as president of Idaho Family Policy Center. Is it okay if I don't use the mic, Jake, this one, since this is recording? Where's Jake at? I'm just going to go like this. I'm going to yell because I taught high school for several years, and I learned how to yell. I prefer it that way. So Idaho Family Policy Center is one of really three multi-issue conservative public policy organizations in the state of Idaho. There's not that much on our side in the state of Idaho. You think of the left, you think of ACLU of Idaho, you think of Planned Parenthood, you think of all the various publicly funded think tanks and public policy organizations that are associated with our public colleges and universities. The left has a lot of infrastructure, has a lot of institutional power, even in a red state like Idaho. But here in Idaho on the right, we don't have much. And so we really do have to band together. We have to find out what our shared values are. And we have to, find a way to leverage the crazy majorities that we have that somehow aren't always reflected in, is it okay if I just yell and don't use the mic? Okay. The crazy majorities that we have that aren't always reflected in the way that, some of our legislators vote. Our legislative agenda this year is threefold. Banning drag shows in public places where children are present, reading the Bible in public schools without instruction or comment, and supporting pregnancy resource centers without government money. And we're going to get into each of these issues. We're going to talk through it. We're going to talk through some of the legal implications. We're going to talk through the policy reasons. We're going to talk through why these proposals are constitutionally defensible and why they're important to support. So let's tackle the first one. House Bill 162 is the School-Sponsored Bible Reading Act. How many of you know that for 100 years, school children in the state of Idaho heard the Bible read at the start of each and every school day? How many knew that? So it's true. Now, how many know that the U.S. Supreme Court has actually affirmed the practice of school-sponsored Bible reading? So in 1844, this was a landmark case. It was Vidal v. Girard's Executors. The U.S. Supreme Court heard a case regarding a will that was establishing a public college and a public school in the city of Philadelphia. And one of the questions was whether the school and the college could have the Bible read. Because it's going to be a publicly funded school and college. Can the Bible be read? And here's what the U.S. Supreme Court said. They said, why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, without note or comment, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the schools? its general precepts expounded, its evidence is explained, and its glorious principles of morality inculcated. Why may not the Bible be read in our schools? Man, how I wish that U.S. Supreme Court justices would talk that way today. Now, throughout early America, school-sponsored Bible reading was a common practice. Our founding fathers supported it. This is Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was considered by John Adams to be one of the three most important founding fathers. He signed the Declaration. He helped frame the U.S. Constitution. And Benjamin Rush in 1830, he wrote a letter that was later republished as a pamphlet. The pamphlet was called A Defense of the Bible in Public Schools or in Schools. And this is what he said. The Bible should be read in our schools in preference to all other books. And he goes through 11 or 12 reasons why the Bible must be read in our schools. Samuel Adams believed the same thing. Samuel Adams said that the two foremost purposes of education is one, to create good citizens, and two, to teach the principles of the Christian religion, because you can't have constitutional government without that moral and virtuous and religious foundation upon which constitutional government is based. So this is what Samuel Adams said. He said, inculcating in the minds of youth the fear and love of the deity and universal philanthropy, that's the first goal of education. And then he said, and in subordination to these great principles, the love of their country, of instructing them in the art of self-government, without which they never can act a wise part in the government of societies, great or small. In short, of leading them in the study and practice of the exalted virtues of the Christian system. Good citizens, people who understand the Judeo-Christian heritage upon which our constitutional system of government is built. Noah Webster was another founding father. He's called the father of American education. And here's what he said. The Christian religion is the most important and one of the first things in which all children under a free government ought to be instructed. So our founding fathers in Idaho understood this as well. In 1889, when they met for the state constitutional convention, one of the issues that they debated was whether the Bible should be read in schools, whether there should be religious instruction. They debated this issue for quite some time. Last summer, 2 summers ago, Grace, some of our team read through, 2 summers ago, we read through the state constitutional convention debates. Has anyone here ever read the state constitutional convention debates? Read the state constitution? As conservatives, we care so much about our U.S. Constitution, but so few of us have thought to even read our state constitution and study the principles of our state constitution. And here's when our state founding fathers debated Bible reading in schools, here's what they said. This is James Reed. James Reed served as vice president of the Idaho State Constitutional Convention. And he said, it's because the Bible is read and preached and taught in the schools that this country is great and glorious. If you leave the Bible and its teachings out of your new state, take them out of your government, I tell you that every Christian man in this territory will rise up and put his foot on this Constitution. Another delegate from Lewiston was James Poe. He said, this Constitutional Convention was organized, as it were, by the Christian people of this country to say that the Bible should be excluded from the public schools. I would consider an act which would do more than all other acts to condemn the work of this Constitutional Convention. If we allow a constitution that prevents the Bible, that excludes the Bible from being used in public schools, that would be to our shame as a state and our shame and to the shame of our Constitution. William Claggett was president of the Constitutional Convention. He said, excluding the children of the state from access to the great reservoir of moral principles and political maxims found in Scripture would do a great injustice to our state at large. Again, this idea, right, that the Judeo-Christian morality that's taught in Scripture is essential to our system of government. It's essential to our state functioning well and flourishing. Our children have to have familiarity and exposure to these Judeo-Christian values. that the Bible teaches. This guy is Alexander Mayhew. He's a pretty gent. He was one of the few deists in the Idaho State Constitutional Convention. So this is not a believer. He talks about how he doesn't read the Bible. But even Alexander Mayhew, one of the deists at the State Constitutional Convention, he said, "I desire that the Bible may be read in our schools, but that no denomination shall teach in the schools any sectarian doctrine." The idea that the Bible should be read without obstruction or comment, but there shouldn't be religious teaching to promote one denomination over another, one sectarian interpretation over another. And this is where the founding fathers eventually landed. So here in Idaho, from the time of our state constitutional convention on, the Constitution allowed public schools to have the Bible read to students without instruction, comment, or interpretation. So 1889 was our state constitutional convention. The status quo of allowing schools to decide whether they were going to have the Bible read to students without instruction or comment, that continued until 1925, when the Idaho legislature passed a mandatory school Bible reading law. Again, this mandatory school Bible reading law said at the beginning of each school day, in every occupied classroom, the teacher has to read excerpts from the Bible without instruction, comment, or interpretation. That continued until 1964. So for those who are Supreme Court watchers and enjoy your legal jurisprudential history, in 1963, there was a landmark case called Abington v. Shemp, in which the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated state school Bible reading laws. They used a test that had been developed. It eventually became known as the Lemon test. And this is the same test, by the way, that the U.S. Supreme Court used to take prayer out of schools, to prohibit state legislatures from having legislative chaplains open legislative sessions in prayer, to prevent churches from renting school buildings after hours, right? This Lemon test that was used to take the Bible out of schools was really problematic throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. And from 1964 on, it became, unconstitutional, the Supreme Court would say, for schools to read the Bible to students. Now, that all changed in 2022. So does anyone know who this guy is? This is Coach Joe Kennedy. You guys really need to see the movie Average Joe if you haven't seen it. It's a movie about this guy's life and about his U.S. Supreme Court case. So Joe Kennedy was a football coach at Bremerton High School in Washington State. And after every football game, he went down to pray on the 50-yard line. And he would give glory to God. At first, students joined him. Bremerton High School administrators told him, hey, you can't pray with students. So then he started just doing it by himself, going out to the 50-yard line, praying after the football games. And he was eventually fired for it. He sued the school district. That case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, which was written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, the U.S. Supreme Court finally got rid of that Lemon test that was used to take religious expression out of the public square. The U.S. Supreme Court said that instead of the Lemon test, they were going to now use what's called the history and tradition test. So this is what Gorsuch said in his opinion. This court has instructed that the Establishment Clause must be interpreted by reference to historical practices and understandings. The line that courts and governments must draw between the permissible and impermissible has to accord with history and faithfully reflect the understanding of the Founding Fathers. So now the U.S. Supreme Court is going to ask, when there's religious expression in government that's being challenged under the First Amendment, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to ask, is this expression consistent with the tradition? And is it consistent with the historical understandings of how the First Amendment was understood by the Founding Fathers and the founding generation at the time of ratification? Well, guess what? School-sponsored Bible reading, there's a long-standing tradition, not only here in Idaho, but in almost every state. across the country, children heard the Bible read in their public school classrooms. Our founding fathers supported the practice. They understood the importance of the practice. Our U.S. Constitution was understood to allow it. The gentleman who wrote the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, Fisher Ames, he talked about the importance of school-sponsored Bible reading, of Bible reading in schools. Our state founding fathers, they wanted it. So certainly school-sponsored Bible reading would survive judicial scrutiny under this new history and tradition test that the U.S. Supreme Court promulgated in the Kennedy case in 2022. And so that's why we've put together the School-Sponsored Bible Reading Act, House Bill 168. It's sponsored by Representative Jordan Redmond from Coeur d'Alene. And essentially, it creates statewide policy for public school teachers to read excerpts from the Bible to their classrooms without instruction or comment. So again, this is consistent with what our state founding fathers wanted. Not sectarian teaching, just the Bible being read out loud to students. It requires schools to provide reasonable accommodations to teachers and students with conscience objections. We feel that's important. If a teacher doesn't want to read the Bible, or if a student and their family don't want the student to participate, you provide them reasonable accommodations, but the Bible is going to be read to every occupied school classroom every morning, every day. And then finally, the way that we've crafted this legislation and the way the case law currently sits, this legislation would not open the door to the use of other religious texts in schools. So this is a question we get often. What about the Quran? What about other religious texts? There is no equal time requirement for books that are read or texts that are read in public schools. So just because you have the Bible read, that does not mean that you must also have the Quran read. It doesn't mean you must also read Hindu texts or other religious texts. Additionally, there is no history and tradition here in Idaho or anywhere across the country of the Quran or other religious texts being read or taught to public school students. So it could be that it would even be unconstitutional under the history and tradition test to have the Quran read and other religious texts read in that way as part of a requirement for just normal school operations. So what this legislation does is it recognizes the educational importance of having the Bible read to students, right? The importance of students being familiar with biblical text and biblical values, biblical morality, all of which undergirds our constitutional system of government here in the United States and here in Idaho, while also preserving our cultural tradition and our cultural heritage. Because it is a blessing to live in a country that's been shaped by biblical truth. And we need to preserve that for future generations. Now, this legislation is popular, even though it's highly controversial. And even in our pluralistic and secular society, still 53% of likely Idaho voters support this legislation. Right now, this bill is in House Education. It was printed, Grace, how long ago? 6 weeks ago? 7 weeks ago? And we're hoping that we're going to have a committee hearing in the next few days, maybe early next week. So once that happens, the bill will start moving through the building. Because we have not yet had the full House Education hearing, here's what I'm going to ask you guys to do right now. We have an action center. It's really easy. If you take out your cell phones right now and you take a picture of this, it's going to take you to the action center. And you can put in your name and put in your address, and it'll automatically send emails to the legislators that we're targeting on this legislation. So please do it. Just take out your phone right now and do this. This can really help. If we can swamp the legislature with 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 emails on this issue, it's really going to help grease the skids and get this legislation moving, because it really is so important. So I'll leave this up for 20 more seconds. Just take out your phone, take a picture, click on that QR code right there, and it'll take you to the page. And you just put in your info, it'll automatically send messages on your behalf. It really does matter. Anyone who works with legislators here, they know our legislators don't hear from constituents to the same degree that legislators in other states do or congressmen do. And so when you contact your legislator, it really does matter. You can make a big difference reaching out to your state legislator and asking them to support or oppose a particular piece of legislation. And this makes it really easy to do that. Next bill that was on our agenda, House Bill 230, protects children from indecent sexual exhibitions. So, we've all seen what's been going on across the state. These are pictures from events out in public with kids across the state of Idaho in the last 3 to 4 years. The one right there, bottom middle, that's at Boise Pride in the park just across the street from the Capitol building. If you walk down the front steps, cross the street, that's where that took place. That's a stripper pole where adults are pole dancing in front of kids. Of course, the drag shows, right? They're kids' drag events, burlesque performances. This is really uncomfortable to look at. But this is what's going on across the state of Idaho, and our laws are woefully inadequate to address this issue. They're outdated, they're inadequate, they need to be updated, and they need to be made more robust. And here's the thing, guys. We don't let kids into strip clubs. We don't let kids into adult movie theaters. So why do we allow children into public parks, or why, let me rephrase that. Why do we allow strip, like pole dancing and drag shows and burlesque performances in public parks where children are present? That's why we drafted House Bill 230. This is our indecent sexual exhibitions legislation. It's sponsored by Representative Ted Hill in the House and then Senator Ben Taves and Ben Adams in the Senate. And it utilizes the indecency standard that the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has used for over 70 years now to regulate daytime television broadcast. So essentially, if it's appropriate for daytime television broadcast, it's appropriate for public parks. If it's not appropriate for daytime television broadcast, it can't take place in public or other places where children might be present. It functions as a constitutionally permissible time, place, and manner regulation. So the U.S. Supreme Court has said if you don't ban speech, but you say, to protect kids or protect communities, hey, certain types of speech and expression can't take place in certain places where kids are expected to be present, that's constitutionally permissible. This legislation does not ban any sexual exhibitions. It simply says you can't have sexual exhibitions in public places or other places where children might be present. We've crafted the legislation to protect non-indecent artistic performances, so it's been carefully crafted to avoid run-of-the-mill cheerleading, dancing, pageants, theatrical cross-dressing, etc. Right? We have seen some laws in other states that were overly broad, dealing especially with the drag show issue, where they wrote the law so broad that it would include things like the Robin Williams film Mrs. Doubtfire, right? Where there's like theatrical cross-dressing that occurs. We've carefully crafted this legislation to avoid those sorts of pitfalls. And then finally, and this last one is important, we don't have criminal penalties. Here's why. Criminal penalties are great if you have prosecutors that are willing to enforce those criminal penalties. But if you don't have a prosecutor who's willing to bring criminal charges on these politically hot button controversial issues, the law has no teeth. And so what we found as really effective is giving legal recourse to the children and their parents when the child suffers harm as a result of the illegal activity, the tortious conduct. We give what's called a civil cause of action, so a right to sue the people who committed the harm. And then the child and the family, they're the ones who are able to receive damages, restitution essentially, for the harm that the child suffered. Because guess what? Sexual exhibitions cause children harm. When children are exposed to these sexual exhibitions, there's a wealth of academic literature on this. Children are harmed. And they are the ones who need the legal recourse in order to recover damages for the harm they suffered and to ensure these things don't happen again to other kids. And so that's why what we're doing here is we're creating a civil cause of action for these children and their parents to sue the organizers or the performers of these indecent sexual exhibitions as a way of enforcing the law instead of relying on the prosecuting attorneys. This legislation is very popular among Idaho voters. The question was, would you support legislation that bans drag shows and burlesque and pole dancing and other sexual exhibitions in public places where children are present or other places where children are present? And we had 71% of likely Idaho voters say yes, they would support that legislation. That is supermajority. That's huge. Like we commission a lot of polling on a lot of issues. It's rare you see issues where you have 71% support one way or another. So this legislation has made it through the House. We got off the House floor with a veto-proof supermajority. We're waiting for a committee hearing in Senate State Affairs right now. And we'd certainly appreciate your prayers. We're working behind the scenes to make it happen. We're hopeful and we're optimistic that we'll get a committee hearing. It's just, sometimes it's all about persuasion and helping other people to understand the importance of legislation like this. So we are working hard to ensure that we're able to get a committee hearing in Senate State Affairs. Then the last bill on our legislative agenda this year is the Investing in Mothers and Families Act. So as Jake mentioned, in 2022, the state legislature adopted the heartbeat law. The day the heartbeat law went into effect, the abortion rate in Idaho, the legal abortion rate in Idaho dropped to zero effectively. There were 5 abortions in the 12 months following the heartbeat law going into effect. There's been 4 abortions in the last 12 months. We have reduced abortions in the state of Idaho by 99.7%. Praise God for that. Now, are there illegal abortions taking place with black market chemical abortion pills? Yes, right? That existed prior to abortion being made illegal in the state of Idaho. That will always exist. The legislature needs to find ways to address that issue, certainly. Do we currently have a rape and incest exception in our laws that's unbiblical and unjust? Yes, we do, right? No child should ever be killed through abortion because of the circumstances of their conception. And so it's regrettable that we have that rape and incest exception in our abortion laws. But those have been so tightly crafted that so far there's never been an abortion performed in Idaho under either of those exceptions. All that to say, we've come a long ways, for which we praise God, and we have a long ways to go. Removing the rape and incest exceptions, establishing personhood, all these things are important things the legislature must do in the coming years. But right now, we feel like one thing that should unite the pro-life community and should have broad support among the legislators is helping our local pregnancy resource centers, but doing it in such a way that no government money is being spent on them. So House Bill 342 is the Investing in Mothers and Families Act. It's sponsored in the House by Representative John Schertz, and it creates special tax benefits for private donations to pregnancy resource centers and maternity homes. Here in Idaho, you guys may know this, we have special charitable tax credits for certain causes. So substance abuse centers, group homes, food pantries. There's a special tax credit for when you give your personal private money to those organizations. You're able to claim 50% credit on the donations that you make. And so what this legislation would do is it would add pregnancy resource centers to that list, and it would raise the tax credit limit for donations to all the eligible charities that are currently covered under the special charitable tax credits. So pregnancy resource centers, for those who don't know, are organizations that provide financial support, medical assistance, practical assistance, spiritual help to women and families that are facing unplanned pregnancies. They're doing great work on the front lines, helping provide alternatives to abortion. Maternity homes are places where women who get pregnant and they have no place else to go, no place else to live, they can go live in a maternity home for not only the duration of the pregnancy, but oftentimes for a year, 2 years, 3 years after they've given birth in order to, get up on their feet, get a job, be able to provide for themselves and their kids, have a safe place to live. These organizations are doing great things. They need our support, but they don't need our government money. So lately, there's been a lot of discussion in this building about using government money to help fund these pregnancy resource centers and these maternity homes that are doing so much good work in this post-abortion Idaho that we live in today. And while that's very well intentioned, it's simply not the role of government to help, charity work. That's not the role of government. So what this legislation would do, according to our economic modeling, is it would generate an additional $1.7 million in private charitable giving to pregnancy centers and maternity homes. That's a ton of money. There's about 18 pregnancy centers and maternity homes across the state of Idaho. And here's the thing. When we go and we talk with pregnancy resource centers, because we have great relationships with the pregnancy resource centers across the state, they don't want the government money. This is Heather Lawless. She runs the Reliance Pregnancy Resource Center in Lewiston. We brought her down for our committee hearing at House Reverend Tax a couple of weeks ago to talk with the committee why they don't want government money and why they want the special charitable tax credit instead. Here's what she said. She said, "We pride ourselves in telling our donors that Reliance Ministries does not take government funding. From offering a full spectrum of care support, government funding often comes with strings attached, making it difficult, if not impossible, to provide the whole person support that transforms lives. Government funding can restrict discussions about faith, limit the depth of relationships we build with our clients, and prevent us from offering a full spectrum of care support." Because here's the thing, when you take government money, there's always going to be strings attached, right? To get the government cheese, you have to step into the mousetrap. And she recognizes this. She doesn't want the pregnancy resource center that she runs becoming dependent on government money, and then the government using that money to tell them how to help women and families in their community. Doug Hansen is the chairman of the board for Lifeline Pregnancy Resource Center. We brought him down for the committee hearing as well, and here's what he told the committee. He said, "Lifeline is 100% donor funded. We receive no government money, and we don't want to receive government money. In fact, we prefer this tax credit program over proposals for direct government grants to PRCs because there are no government strings attached." He said, "With direct government subsidies, the legislature can attach strings to money at any time, forcing us to significantly change the way we operate and perhaps even prohibiting us from operating as Christian ministry. Because of this, we have reservations about taking government money, and we prefer to rely upon the support of our community." So important that these pregnancy resource centers have the resources they need to serve women and families in their communities without government interference and dependency upon the welfare state, ultimately. Now, this legislation is also popular among Idaho voters. 68% of likely Idaho voters support expanding the charitable tax credit to include donations to pregnancy resource centers. I will say there have been a lot of tax cuts this year, and there's a sense within the building that maybe they've done too much in terms of tax cuts. Now, I think there are ways to address that: cut government spending in certain areas, cut waste, etc. But right now, we've been told there's no more tax cut legislation that's going through the building. So this legislation, we introduced it this year, we'll bring it back next year, and we're hopeful that next year we'll be able to get this across the finish line. Because again, it's providing real alternatives to abortion without getting people hooked on the welfare state. That's what this is all about. So as I said, we got the print hearing. We'll come back with this legislation next year. So, we talk about how our founding fathers understood that morality, family, biblical values, traditional values, these things undergirded our constitutional system of government. And we can't have a properly functioning republic without having that strong foundation of virtue and morality and religion to rely upon. Charles Finney was a very famous American evangelist in the 1800s. He was the most prominent evangelist during the Second Great Awakening. And he saw a need for Christians to get involved in politics. He said, you got to remember the battle over slavery at the time was heating up. This was going into the Civil War. And he says that he saw at the time a great need for Christians to stand up and to stand for biblical values and traditional values that had made our nation great, and through which we would receive God's favor and live under the blessings of liberty. And so Charles Finney said, God cannot sustain this free and blessed country, which we love and pray for, unless the church will take the right ground. Politics are part of religion in such a country as this, and Christians must do their duty to the country as part of their duty to God. It seems sometimes as if the foundations of the nation were becoming rotten, and Christians seem to act as if they thought God did not see what they do in politics. But I tell you, He does see it, and God will bless or curse this nation according to the course they take. Christians, people of faith, we have to get involved. We have to stand for biblical values. That's going to be what's going to make our country great again. Going to God, asking Him for His assistance, and standing up for what's right. And that's what we're trying to do here at IFBC. We're just grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that and the privilege that God gives us in doing that. So thank you guys. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have, and would certainly appreciate your prayers as well.
So if anyone has any questions, please come up here, speak into the mic for the benefit of the live stream. So, do you have any questions?
Of course, Rob. It's your event.
Love the statistics you showed, especially on abortion. The most compelling one for me was the 99.7% reduction in abortions in Idaho.
Yeah.
In raw numbers, what does that mean? Because I think we were at 1,500 during legal, I guess.
Yeah.
And so does that mean we're down to like 5 abortions a year?
Yeah. So we were bouncing around between 1,500 and 1,800 abortions a year in the several years leading up to the heartbeat law, and then a month later, the trigger law going into effect. So we've seen a reduction from, roughly 1,500-1,600 abortions down to 5 abortions in the 12 months following this law going into effect. In the last 12 months, we've only had 4 abortions in the state of Idaho. So if you think about that, that's thousands of babies that have been saved. Now, again, I don't want to downplay illegal abortions, women going out of state. Like, we need to address those issues. But we have essentially made Idaho an abortion-free state.
Actually, my question was different than that, but do we trust that reporting?
Yeah, so the civil liability for the hospitals and the physicians, if they don't do the reporting, the mandatory reporting to the Department of Health and Welfare, it's a lot of liability.
Okay.
So we have no reason to believe that they're not reporting the abortions they're required to report.
Okay.
Now, I will say there's a very small loophole in the mandatory reporting statute when it comes to a certain type of abortion called induction abortions. So this is where you have the woman give birth to the child prematurely, and the baby passes away as a result of the premature delivery.
Can we ever get that renamed? Because obviously it's not an abortion at that point.
Yeah, so, maybe philosophically and morally it's not an abortion. Legally it still is, just the way that we've defined abortion in our state code. And so, we've talked internally, and we've talked with legislators and others, policymakers, about the wisdom of changing those definitions. There might be some wisdom in it, but for right now, legally, that is an abortion. It should be reported to the Department of Health and Welfare. It's currently not. Again, that's probably a very small number. But it would be helpful if we updated our abortion reporting statute to make sure that those abortions were reflected in the statistics as well.
All right, so my actual question was regarding the last one that you talked about, the tax credit on getting a larger amount for your charitable.
Yeah.
Did I also see something about a special account being created?
Yeah, so what that legislation would do, so there's actually three portions of it. The first portion is the special charitable tax credit for donations to pregnancy resource centers and maternity homes. The second section is raising the limit that you can claim of the donations that you give, so that you're able to receive a larger tax credit. And then the third portion is allowing people to designate part of their state tax refunds to the Choose Life Idaho organization. That's the organization that already handles grants for pregnancy resource centers through the license plate program, the Choose Life license plate program. You've seen those around the state.
Okay.
And so that's still private money, and it actually pays for itself.
Okay.
The money that people designate toward that fund, a portion of it is taken for the administrative costs, and then that's given to the Choose Life Idaho.
Okay, but it's still then managed somehow by the government.
It's so the Treasury, the state treasurer has a fund that all they do is they receive the money and then they give it out. So yeah, sort of, kind of, but no government money is being used to administer it. Yeah, but you got to remember too, I mean, the whole state tax system is managed by the state treasurer. So.
Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question, but I think my voice is loud enough. Is that okay?
This goes through the stream, if you don't mind. Sorry.
I just had a question about the House Bill 165, the state-sponsored Bible reading.
Yeah.
I'm all for that, but the question I had is, if you have a teacher that opts out of that, will they have somebody? Will there be a substitution if that becomes a law, and it is to be read in class every morning or every day? How do they manage that? Is there any verbiage in there in regards to how they'll replace the teacher?
Yeah, we don't have any language in there specifically, and that's on purpose. So we would allow the school district to decide how they want to provide those reasonable accommodations. I could foresee a student reading the Bible instead of the teacher, or an administrator, or somebody who has a break in their schedule, like they have the first period as a break, they can come in. There's a bunch of ways that the school could provide that reasonable accommodation for the teacher, but the requirement is the Bible must be read to each occupied classroom at the start of each school day.
So if the bill is passed, they will just explain that to the administrators, like, you decide how to work that out.
Yeah, giving the local school districts the freedom to make those policies on how they're going to provide those accommodations.
Any other questions? Okay. Seeing none. Thank you, everyone. Please give it up for Blaine Conzatti.
Thank you, guys.